America, America. So today we'll be talking about America, well, the Americas, during the Columbian Exchange. Me from the past, what are you doing in my chair? So we're going to talk about Spain and Portugal's conquest, and we're going to divide that into basically three phases. We've got the first phase from 1492 all the way to 1570. This is the time period where roughly 90% of the Native American population is wiped out, mostly because of disease, but also because of war, famine, that kind of thing. This is also when you see the first European colonies. Many of these European colonies were supposed to be temporary. Are you having fun there, me from the past? Okay. Then, starting around the 1570 to the 1700s, you start to get minor alterations, and you start to see colonies transition from temporary kind of mining towns almost into their own societies. And then, in the third period, we have the 1700s. This is when we have colonial institutions that reform, and sometimes those that don't reform lead to revolts. Or sometimes those that do reform anyway also experience revolts. So it used to be the case that Spain was ruled by the good old-fashioned Cordoba Caliphate, or at least a chunk of Spain was ruled by the Cordoba Caliphate. But then the Reconquista comes along, and then Spain appears. So Spain pushes the Cordoba Caliphate back and back until eventually Granada falls. Now, the Spanish Reconquista has actually been ongoing for a few hundred years, but it really revs up when King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castilla marry and their two kingdoms merge, creating more or less the modern-day state of Spain. Now, when they merge together, Spain's identity becomes enmeshed in the Catholic Church. In other words, to be Spanish is to be Catholic. So the question is, what happens to non-Catholics? Well, the answer, according to the Spanish Inquisition, is you better rethink that.
Spanish Inquisition? Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Amongst our weaponry are such diverse elements as fear, pride, ruthless bigotry, and almost fanatical devotion to the Pope in a nice red uniform. Oh, damn!
So what happens to those Jews and Muslims who refuse to convert? Well, the answer is they are expelled from Spain. And remember, the Jewish and Muslim communities have been in Spain for hundreds of years. The Muslim community has been there for, well, since the year 700 or so CE. And this is motivated by the fact that under Ferdinand and Isabella, Catholic identity is part of Spain's identity itself. So this actually causes some significant economic problems for the Spanish because, among other things, you have a huge expulsion of people like doctors, bankers, people who are highly educated who contribute to the economy significantly. Many of them are expelled in this purge. So it's argued that in addition for riches and to expand Spain's sort of ailing economy, Isabel and Ferdinand want to use Columbus as a way to expand Christianity, and specifically Catholic Christianity, to the New World. So who were the people initially responsible for expanding Christianity to the New World? The conquistadors! Because everybody loves to be converted at sword point. Now, in Spanish, conquistador basically just means conqueror. Now, the word conquistador in Spanish Basically just means conqueror. However, the conquistadors are, let's just say, an eclectic bunch. They weren't really professional soldiers. They really weren't professional anythings. A lot of them were basically a group of friends or companions or acquaintances that decided to get together and, conquer the New World and some stuff. That sounds ridiculous, I understand, but sometimes history is pretty ridiculous. One of the big attractions to become a conquistador is that it allowed for opportunities of social mobility. So already you have the association in Europe with the New World as being a land of social mobility, a land where using hard work, education, skill, determination, what have you, you can rise up the social ladder and perhaps even become something like a noble in the New World. So we have kind of the foundations for what we would later on call the American dream. However, that is not an endorsement of the conquistadors themselves. They are many things. Nice is not one of those things. These are people who definitely didn't mind bending the rules in order to get what they want. More on that later. Now, when they arrive in the New World, basically you see that they have a number of significant military advantages. Horses, firearms, and steel weapons. Specifically, the steel weapons are the big thing. Now, these individuals were generally fairly successful, surprisingly, but these also aren't people who are all that skilled in questions of like administration. So eventually, by around the 1570s, you get bureaucrats, merchants, and colonists who replace the first generation of conquistadors. Probably the most famous of the conquistadors was Hernan Cortez. Cortez was just like a random guy that worked in the Spanish administration in Cuba. He was basically like a lawyer slash bureaucrat. So essentially think of him as an office worker. But he sort of catches the bug for New World glory and proposes an expedition led by him where he goes off and conquers it. Well, he is not given permission to do that, so he assumes that it's better to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission, and so does it anyway. The Spanish viceroy actually sends a fleet to pursue Cortez and arrest him. So once he gets to the New World, let's just say that he's already in a pretty stressful mood. For Cortez, he lucks out and finds one of the most remarkable women in the history of the Americas, the Dona Marina, or a Native American woman by the name of Malinche. She apparently speaks Spanish, Mayan, and Nahuatl, and basically can act as an interpreter between Cortez and essentially most of the large Native American groups that he comes across. Cortez had a number of extremely lucky breaks. If you're putting this into D&D terms, think of Cortez as the guy who basically rolls 5 straight critical successes. He rolls a critical success when he finds the Dona Marina. He rolls a critical success in the sense that he has superior military technology. He rolls a critical success in the sense that the Aztecs believe that he is the return form of Quetzalcoatl. He gains a critical success in the sense that he is able to negotiate a large Native American alliance with the Spanish at the head in order to defeat the Aztecs, and then he rolls a critical success in capturing Montezuma. So in 1521, Tenochtitlan is burnt to the ground, and over its ashes, Mexico City is constructed. And as a consequence, most of central Mexico becomes the viceroyalty of New Spain. And New Spain, in and of itself, is one of the largest pieces of geography in the world, and also one of the largest political entities that we'll talk more about. So if we're looking at South and Central America, we have Vasco da Balboa, who establishes a colony in Panama in search of gold. Remember, he's the first European to see the Pacific, as if that should be a major achievement unlocked, but there we go, or there we are. Finally, the major conquistador in the history of South America is Francisco Pizarro. When Francisco Pizarro arrives in the Incan Empire, basically the Incan Empire is in the midst of a civil war, and so the empire is extremely weakened. The victor of the civil war is the Incan Emperor Atahualpa. However, Francisco Pizarro basically captures Atahualpa with about 200 men. And because of the fact that Atahualpa was captured, Pizarro basically bluffs his way into getting an entire room full of gold, after which Pizarro rewards Atahualpa with being strangled to death. So, yeah, nice guy. Just like in the case of Tenochtitlan, you have the city basically being replaced with a new Spanish one. So the capital city of Cusco is replaced with Lima in the current nation of Peru. In 1540, you also have an expedition through the central southwestern United States going as far as Kansas. This is led by Francisco de Coronado. And so what you basically see is the Spanish are basically going about near everywhere. By 1570, so we're talking about less than 100 years after Columbus's discovery of the New World, there were over 192 Spanish cities throughout the Americas. So, Spain, in less than about 100 years, conquers two entire continents. So then the question is, how do you actually rule all of that from the comfort of Madrid? And the answer is, well, you don't. Essentially, Spain's New World possessions were led by viceroyalties, or viceroys, who are basically supposed to be deputy kings, hence the term viceroy. And so there were two of them in the New World at first. The first one basically governed all of this up here, the Viceroyalty of New Spain. And that viceroy basically lived in Mexico City. And of course, you had the viceroy essentially of South America. And basically, he lived in the Spanish capital of Lima, Peru. So in theory, they're supposed to report to the king, but because of communication times across the Atlantic, in practice, they basically ran the colonies by themselves. So they created laws, applied the laws, collect taxes, and assigned work to the Native Americans who did not die of disease or war, and also were commanders of the royal armies in the New World. In theory, there was a Council of the Indies, which was a bureaucracy that issued laws, gave advice on New World matters, and oversaw the colonies. And it established 10 judicial divisions with courts. But the reality is that the viceroys and the viceroyalities could basically do whatever it was that they wanted. Now we're going to talk about Portugal's possessions in the New World, but to do that, we kind of have to start talking about where the Portuguese Empire kind of comes from. Because remember, Portugal takes the lead in pioneering new types of navigational technology and ocean-going vessels. So the story of New World colonization actually begins with the Azores and basically the island of Madeira. So these islands are in the middle of the Atlantic, but basically what you kind of see in the case of these islands is you see a native population with little immunity to European diseases, who are actually the descendants, interestingly, of the ancient Carthaginians. In other words, they are of North African descent, but basically they've been living in isolation for well over 2,000 or so years. So the Spanish come in, the Portuguese come in, they expect the natives to essentially be like plantation workers, but disease kills all the natives, and so what do the Portuguese have to do? Well, they have to rely upon black slaves from West Africa as a way to basically cultivate sugar. Essentially, with Brazil, they apply that same model. So the Spanish were sort of opportunistic in the sense that they primarily were looking for gold, but they would basically try to grow or mine or steal or take anything that was in easy reach. The Portuguese, I think it's probably fair to say, have a much better idea of what they want to do. At first, their main attraction is the dyewood trees in Brazil. But later on, Brazil becomes the leading sugar producer, period. So you see sugar plantations establish themselves using Native American labor to set up. The problem is that because of disease, most of them die, and of course, that labor isn't anywhere near enough. So once again, you start to see the dependence on black slaves from West Africa. By 1630, Brazil had a population of about 100,000 people, including 30,000 Europeans and 15,000 slaves. If you look just 70 years later, by 1700, Brazil had a population of 150,000 slaves, which basically is half of Brazil's total population. Roughly 7,000 slaves are imported every year, and it was estimated that every 10 years, there would be a 100% attrition rate in the slave population, which is just bonkers and disgusting to think about. 1549, you see the arrival of the first Jesuit missionaries. 1695, much later, you see gold discovered in Minas Gerais. My Portuguese is very suspect, by the way. And then by 1720, you see Brazil become a viceroyalty as well. So now we're going to close out with British and French colonies in North America. And they babies. The British colonies especially, I mean, it might surprise us because we know that eventually the British will sort of establish that empire on which the sun never set. But the British, they're sort of slow to start the race. And a lot of England's desire for colonization is less about wealth than about getting out religious dissenters. Basically, you have the colony of Jamestown, founded in 1607, that's established for many of the same reasons that Spain founds its colonies, for wealth and prestige and all that. But essentially, the early English colonies there were essentially supposed to be pirate bases, ways to attack Spanish caravans bound for Europe, so they could basically prey on some of that Spanish gold. Then they also discover that the swampy area around Jamestown is good for growing tobacco, and then it's also discovered that tobacco is addictive, so hey, you got a cash crop, even if you have bad lungs as a consequence. In the northern Atlantic seaboards, we're talking about modern-day New England, including Massachusetts, that area, you have religious dissenters. These are the English Puritans, who feel they have been persecuted by the state for their religious beliefs. The first group that comes is the Pilgrims. They come a little bit earlier, and the Pilgrims, basically the only difference is they want to split from the Church of England. Then you have the Puritans that arrive in and around 1630. There's a lot of them, and they really just want to purify the Church of England, and they want to purify the Church of England by creating this model godly society. Okay, now for the French, most of France's colonies in the New World lie along the St. Lawrence River here. So there's about 55,000 settlers, many of whom eventually take Native American wives, by the way, and mostly they're working as fur trappers. Essentially, believe it or not, the most valuable commodity that the French basically extracted from Canada was the beaver pelt. And actually that was such an important commodity that there was a beaver war that unfortunately wasn't fought between beavers, but instead was fought between different groups, including the French, for who would get to command the beaver trade. Not even joking. France generally had a fairly harmonious relationship with the Native Americans, partially because they needed Native Americans to help them hunt. Now, for England's colonies, the English were sort of standoffish. And the English came with entire families and communities more or less already established. So, in the case of Spain, you had lots of intermarriage and relationships between the Spanish and the Native Americans, partially because most of the original conquistadors were just, sort of young single males. In contrast, again, the English came in with more or less entire societies already established. So this sort of pushes Native Americans increasingly westward as the English sort of slowly but surely displace them on their own land. So that, however, does not preclude the English from also participating in the slave trade, especially in the American South. By the 1700s, roughly 23% of the population of the southern colonies was of African origin. And if you look at newly founded colonies like South Carolina, 60% of the population was enslaved. All of this basically gets destabilized because of a global war that takes place in 1756 called the 7 Years' War. The TLDR here is that England surprisingly emerges the victor basically against everybody, but that is a story for another time.